My name is Walter Mason, and I am 81 years old. The house where I live stands on the edge of a small Vermont town, a place so quiet that sometimes in winter you can hear the trees creak in the frost as if they were breathing. My wife, Mabel, and I moved here 42 years ago, when the land was still raw and the road ended in a field of weeds. She saw the potential in the emptiness. "We'll make it bloom," she said that first spring, and she did. The garden that surrounds this house is not just a patch of soil. It is a record of our life together, a slow diary written in flowers, one season layered over another until the years themselves became petals and stems and roots sunk deep into the earth. Every corner of it holds her handwriting, how she arranged the lilies so they'd catch the afternoon sun, how she trained the climbing roses against the porch so they'd greet whoever walked up the path. People used to stop their cars on the road just to look at it. The local paper once ran a piece calling it Mason's Eden. Mabel laughed at that, but I could tell she was proud. When she passed away 6 years ago, a part of that garden withered too. She died in early May before the irises opened, and for months afterward I couldn't step outside without feeling that the world had gone silent. I tried to keep the garden alive out of duty at first, then out of habit, and finally out of something closer to prayer. The soil here is rich but stubborn. It demands patience. Every morning I put on her old straw hat. It still carries a faint scent of her shampoo, and walk the beds, talking to the plants like they are family. Maybe they are. Each bloom is a memory I can touch. The day we planted the first tulips, the argument we had about spacing the dahlias, the summer she convinced me to build the pond, even though I swore it would attract mosquitoes. I sometimes imagine her still giving quiet instructions somewhere in the rustle of the leaves. My daughter, Helen, calls once every few weeks out of politeness. She lives an hour away with her husband, Mark, and their teenage son, though they could just as easily be in another country. The last time she came here was last Thanksgiving. She brought a store-bought pie and her impatience. Mark stayed mostly on his phone, wandering around the yard making comments about what a lot of work this place must be for an old man. Helen scolded him gently, but I saw no real warmth in her eyes either, only that brittle concern people wear when they're thinking about practical matters, inheritance, property, responsibilities that might fall on them. They always leave quickly, saying the drive back is long. When the sound of their car fades, the house breathes again, as if relieved. Sometimes I think of how different Helen was as a child. She and Mabel used to spend whole afternoons kneeling side by side in the soil, their hands stained green from trimming herbs. Helen's laughter then had the same lightness as the wind through the poppies. I keep a photo of them in the hallway, both in wide-brimmed hats, both smiling without posing. When I look at it now, I can't decide if that time feels close or impossibly far away. Maybe both. Life stretches and folds like old fabric. You can touch the pattern, but not wear it again. The truth is, I've become a man of routines. I wake up with the sun, make oatmeal and black coffee, and eat at the kitchen table that still bears a scorch mark from when Mabel once set down a hot pan without thinking. After breakfast, I check the greenhouse where her orchids live. She called them her ladies, delicate but stubborn like herself. I spend the afternoons reading on the porch or tending the compost heap, then supper, then television. I barely watch. The hours glide into one another without distinction, except when the light changes. I don't mind the solitude. What I mind is the sense that the world outside the garden has forgotten I exist. The people at the hardware store still nod politely, but I can see the slight uncertainty in their eyes, as if wondering how much longer an old man like me can manage alone. Mabel used to say that aging is like watching a movie in slow motion. You see every frame, every little shift of color and shadow. She was right. The silence of this house is not empty. It is full of echoes, of small sounds that carry entire histories. The creak of the floorboard near the window reminds me of the night our daughter was born. The faint whistle from the kettle's dented lid takes me back to the winter when the pipes froze and we boiled snow for water. Everything here has memory embedded in it. That's why the thought of leaving feels like tearing out roots from the soil. It's not just wood and nails. It's the shape of a life. The garden is my last link to her, and I guard it with the possessiveness of a miser. Every plant, from the rare blue lilies she bred herself to the wild asters that came uninvited, carries a story. Mabel had a gift for cross-pollination. She'd spend evenings sketching combinations in her notebook, experimenting with seeds like a composer arranging notes. Some of her hybrids never bloomed again, but others became miracles of color. Last year, a botanist who visited from the university told me one of her cultivars might be unique, the only of its kind. He asked if I'd ever considered registering it. I told him no. This garden wasn't for fame or commerce. It was for remembrance. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't understand. How could he? Love isn't something you list in a botanical catalog. The winter after that visit was hard. The snow came early, heavy and wet, and several of the trellises collapsed under the weight. I hurt my hip shoveling the path, and for the first time, I felt the cold settle inside my bones in a way that didn't leave. Helen suggested, over the phone of course, that I think about selling the property. "It's too much work for you, Dad," she said. Mark added, "You could get a nice apartment in Burlington, something modern with an elevator." I told them this house has no stairs that matter, only memories, and I'm not ready to move. The conversation ended with that heavy pause that means we're all thinking the same thing, but none of us will say it. They want the house, or at least the land. It's not even greed that stings. It's their lack of reverence. Mark once joked that we could flatten the back acre and build a guest house, as if the roses and irises and rare lilies were just clutter. I said nothing then, because arguing with the young is like shouting into the wind. But I felt a quiet fury rise inside me. That garden isn't just dirt. It's everything Mabel left me. To destroy it would be like burning her letters, erasing her handwriting from the world. Still, I can't hate Helen entirely. She's my only child. There are moments, short, fleeting, when I catch a glimpse of the girl she used to be, the one who brought Mabel wildflowers and left them in jars on the kitchen counter. I think she's trapped between guilt and her husband's ambitions. Mark is practical to the point of cruelty. He measures value in dollars and labor hours, not sentiment. If something doesn't produce income, it's waste. To him, beauty that doesn't pay is useless. I've tried to explain that the worth of this garden isn't in money, but in memory. But my words fall on stony ground. Every spring, I tell myself it might be the last one I'll manage, yet somehow the soil forgives me. When I kneel to plant the bulbs, the smell of earth rises like a benediction. There's pain in my knees, yes, but also peace. I talk to Mabel then, not aloud, but in thought. I tell her about the new shoots, about the weather, about how the world has changed without her. Sometimes a bird lands nearby and cocks its head as if listening. I take that as a sign she's still here, watching, tending her paradise through my clumsy hands. I know how it looks from the outside, a widower clinging to a decaying house and a patch of flowers. Maybe it is pathetic, but for me, it's survival. In every petal that opens, I see proof that something can die and return, altered but alive. That's more than I can say for people. Friends have moved away or been buried, and the calls grow fewer each year. The garden, though, remains faithful. It doesn't judge, doesn't demand explanations. It only asks that I keep faith with it, as I once did with her. I often sit by the pond at dusk, watching the reflections ripple under the fading light. The frogs start their slow chorus, and the air smells of wet stone and grass. In those moments, I almost forget the silence inside the house. I can hear her laugh, if I try hard enough, faint but real, somewhere in the murmur of water and wind. And though the days grow shorter and my body slower, I still believe this garden will outlive me. What I didn't know then, sitting there with my tea and my memories, was that someone I once called family would soon try to destroy it all, out of spite, out of greed, and out of a blindness that would cost them far more than they could ever imagine. It was a Sunday morning in late June, the kind that smells of rain long before the clouds appear, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up the gravel road. Few people ever came here without calling first, and the particular low growl of that engine made my stomach tighten even before I saw the silver truck through the kitchen window. It was Mark's, my son-in-law's prized vehicle, washed so obsessively that it gleamed even under overcast skies. I stood still for a moment, mug in hand, watching as he stepped out, followed by Helen, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. They didn't wave. Mark adjusted his sunglasses, surveyed the house, and gave a small nod, the kind that says he's already judged everything he sees and found it lacking. I could tell by his stride that whatever brought them here wasn't a visit for affection. When they reached the porch, I opened the door before they could knock. Helen tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "Hi, Dad," she said, and her voice had that brittle cheerfulness she used to use when she was about to deliver bad news. Mark stayed a step behind her, scanning the flower beds like an inspector appraising damage. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Coffee's on if you want some." Helen hesitated before answering. "Actually, we were hoping to talk for a bit. Do you have a minute?" I almost laughed at that. Time is all I have left. We went into the living room, where Mabel's photographs still hung above the mantel, their frames slightly crooked, as if her spirit tilted them, just to remind me she was still around. Mark remained standing, hands in his pockets, his weight shifting impatiently. "We've been worried about you, Walter," he began, and I already knew the rest of the script. "This place is a lot to manage, especially the garden. Helen says you've been having trouble with your hip again." I nodded slowly, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing me defensive. "It aches when it rains," I admitted, "but it hasn't stopped me yet." He gave a polite, humorless laugh. "That's admirable, but you're not getting any younger. We just think maybe it's time to consider alternatives." Helen looked down at her hands. "We found a wonderful assisted living community in Burlington," she added quickly. "It's near us, with a nice view of the river and a greenhouse program. You'd have people around, medical support, activities." Her voice trembled just enough for me to know she'd rehearsed the speech and still hated delivering it. I asked the question anyway, even though I already knew the answer. "And what would happen to this place?" Mark didn't hesitate. "You could sell it, of course. Property values are high right now. You'd make good money, and it wouldn't sit here falling apart." His words cut like frost. "Falling apart," I repeated. "You think Mabel's house is falling apart?" Helen reached out as if to calm me. "Dad, that's not what he meant. We just want what's best for you. It's too much responsibility." I looked at them both, the daughter who once chased butterflies through these same fields, and the man who couldn't tell a rose from a dandelion. and I realized there was no part of this conversation that was truly about my welfare. They wanted the land, maybe the insurance money, maybe the comfort of knowing they'd secured their future before mine ended. I told them I appreciated their concern, but that I had no intention of leaving. Mark's expression tightened and his politeness evaporated. "Walter, be reasonable. We're trying to help. You can't live out here forever. What if something happens to you? What if you fall? You could be lying there for days before anyone finds you." I met his gaze evenly. If that's how it ends, that's how it ends. Better here than in a room that smells of bleach. He opened his mouth to argue, but Helen touched his arm, whispering something I couldn't catch. They exchanged one of those silent marital looks that exclude everyone else. Finally, Mark sighed theatrically. "All right. But think about it. We don't want to force your hand." He walked to the window, staring out at the yard. "You've got a lot of stuff out there that could use cleaning up. I could give you a hand next weekend, maybe get rid of some of the clutter." Clutter. That was the word he used for the garden. I didn't respond, afraid of what might come out if I did. They stayed another 15 minutes, drinking coffee that went cold, while conversation sputtered like a dying fire. When they left, Helen hugged me briefly, smelling of expensive perfume and guilt. Mark merely nodded again, already calculating something behind his eyes. The truck roared down the drive, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. I stood on the porch watching it settle, a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with age. That week I tried not to dwell on it, but the thought kept circling back like a persistent crow. I remembered the tone in Mark's voice when he said clutter. I had seen that look before, in the faces of developers who came through town offering to buy up old farms to build vacation homes. To them, land wasn't memory, it was inventory. I told myself they wouldn't dare touch anything without my say-so. Still, a seed of unease took root. I double-checked the gate lock on the tool shed, made sure the greenhouse door was latched, even looked into installing a small camera just to feel some measure of control. The following Saturday morning dawned bright and humid. I was in the greenhouse watering the orchids when I heard the low rumble of that same truck again. My first thought was that something had happened, that maybe Helen had changed her mind and come to apologize. But when I stepped outside, Mark was already in the yard wearing work gloves, his sleeves rolled up, a shovel slung over his shoulder like a weapon. "Morning," he called out with exaggerated cheer. "Thought I'd get started while it's still cool." I stared at him, confused. "Started on what?" He gestured toward the back garden. "Clearing some of this overgrowth. You said I could help." "I said no such thing," I replied. He grinned, that tight superior grin people use when they think an old man's memory is failing. "Come on, Walter. You mentioned it last week. Said it might be good to make room for a new bed." I walked past him toward the flower beds, my pulse quickening. The ground near the pond looked freshly turned, clumps of soil scattered like wounds. Several of the blue lilies, Mabel's hybrids, were lying in a heap, their roots exposed, their delicate stems bent. I knelt down, feeling my knees protest, and touched one gently. The petals were crushed, their color already fading. "What have you done?" I whispered. Mark shrugged. "They were half dead anyway. Thought I'd save you the trouble. You could put grass here, make mowing easier." His voice was infuriatingly calm, as if he were doing me a favor. I stood up slowly, feeling something cold and sharp rise through my chest. "Those aren't weeds," I said. "They're hybrids Mabel created. Some of them are irreplaceable." He looked genuinely surprised for a moment, then smirked. "Irreplaceable? They're flowers, Walter. You can always plant more. The air seemed to thicken between us. I told him to stop immediately, to leave my property and never touch another plant. He raised his hands mock innocently. Hey, I'm just trying to help. You're overreacting. I wanted to shout, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I went inside, trembling so hard I had to brace myself against the kitchen counter. Through the window, I saw him continue working, hacking at the ground like a man digging a grave. Helen arrived an hour later, clearly unaware of what was happening. When she saw the damage, she gasped, running toward me. "Dad, I told him just to trim the edges," she cried. But it was too late. The garden looked like a battlefield, the heart of it, Mabel's lilies, uprooted and broken. I don't remember much of the rest of that day. I know there was shouting, Helen crying, Mark insisting he was only cleaning up. I remember standing over the ruined bed, clutching one of the torn blossoms in my hand, its blue dust staining my skin. I think I muttered something to Mabel, asking her forgiveness for letting this happen. By evening, they were gone, leaving the place eerily quiet except for the distant rumble of thunder. The sky turned the color of old pewter, and the first drops of rain fell onto the mangled soil, turning it to mud. I sat on the porch until darkness came, unable to move, feeling the weight of every year pressed down on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the house in circles, replaying the scene over and over. I kept seeing Mark's face, that dismissive half-smile, and hearing the crunch of roots under his boots. Around midnight, I went out with a flashlight, the beam trembling in my hand. The garden looked worse in the artificial light, the destruction more deliberate. Several of the rare orchids from the greenhouse were missing, the pots overturned. That's when it struck me. This wasn't carelessness. It was spite. Mark wanted to hurt me, to break what he couldn't own. I stood there in the rain, the flashlight flickering, and I swore quietly to the darkness that I would not let this be the end of Mabel's garden. He thought he was dealing with a frail old man clinging to memories, but he had forgotten one simple truth. Memories are stronger than greed, and roots, once planted deep enough, can survive even the cruelest storms. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended quiet, like the air before a storm. The rain had flattened the garden, sealing Mark's destruction under a slick layer of mud. From the kitchen window, the once perfect symmetry of Mabel's flower beds now looked like a scar, dark trenches and broken stems glistening under the morning light. I spent hours out there, not working, just standing among the ruins, unable to decide whether to start restoring or to leave it all untouched as evidence of what had been done. The smell of rotten wet soil mixed with the faint sweetness of crushed petals, and every time I knelt to gather what was left, I felt like I was performing a funeral rather than gardening. The silence of the place was unbearable. I realized I had started talking aloud again, as I used to when Mabel was alive. But now there was an edge of desperation in my voice. I kept telling her I would fix it, that I wouldn't let him erase her life's work. On the third morning, I saw Helen's car in the driveway. She was alone. She came in without knocking, looking thinner, her hair pulled into a careless bun, her face drawn tight. "Dad," she began, "I just wanted to check on you. Mark told me things got a little heated the other day." I said nothing. She followed me out onto the porch, her heels sinking slightly into the damp boards. When she saw the garden, she went pale. "He said he only trimmed the weeds," she whispered. I turned to her slowly. "Is that what he told you? Weeds?" She stared at the devastation, her hand covering her mouth. For a brief moment I thought she might cry, but instead she straightened her shoulders. "He didn't mean harm," she said quietly. He just doesn't understand how much this means to you." That sentence was meant to soothe me, but it had the opposite effect. The way she said it, as though I were a sentimental child overreacting to broken toys, made something break loose inside me. "This isn't about meaning," I said. "It's about respect. He trespassed on something sacred. Those lilies were her life." Helen sighed, already withdrawing, folding her arms like a barrier. "Dad, you can't live in the past forever. Mom's gone. She wouldn't want you to—" I cut her off. "Don't tell me what your mother would or wouldn't want. You didn't know her half as well as you think." The words came out harsher than I intended, and I saw them land like a slap. She looked at me with a mix of pity and anger, then turned toward the car. "I'll talk to him," she said stiffly. "We'll make it right." But nothing was made right. That evening, when I went to the greenhouse, I found 2 of the orchid pots shattered on the floor. The glass door was ajar, though I was sure I'd locked it. A chill ran through me. I told myself maybe the wind had pushed it open. Maybe the storm had done more damage than I realized. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the night sitting by the window with the lights off, watching the yard. Around 2 in the morning, a movement caught my eye. A faint silhouette crossing near the back fence. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rain. The figure paused by the tool shed, then disappeared toward the woods. I didn't go out. I'm old, but I'm not foolish. Instead, I wrote down the time and direction, the way Mabel would have told me to, methodically, calmly. The next morning I decided to take action. I called the police. A young officer came by in a spotless cruiser, his face smooth and uninterested. I told him someone had been trespassing, that rare plants had been destroyed, that I suspected my son-in-law might be involved. He listened politely, taking notes on a pad, nodding in all the wrong places. "So you didn't actually see him?" he asked finally. "Not directly," I admitted, "but he's the only one with reason." The officer closed his notebook. "Without witnesses or footage, it'll be hard to prove. I can file a report if you want." I signed the paper, knowing it would end up forgotten in some drawer. Before leaving, he gave me a look that said he thought I was lonely more than wronged. That stung worse than I expected. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought a motion-activated security camera, the kind you screw under the eaves. The clerk, a young woman with tattoos on her fingers, helped me set it up on my phone. "You can access everything through the app," she said. "It records automatically if there's movement." I thanked her, feeling both ridiculous and oddly triumphant, like a soldier preparing for a battle no one else believed in. By dusk, the device was installed, pointing directly at the flower beds Mark had torn apart. I tested it twice, watching myself on the screen, a frail old man moving through the wreckage of his own past. The next few days were uneventful. The weather cleared, the soil began to dry, and I tried to focus on repair. I replanted what could be saved, though every hole I dug felt like an accusation. Mabel had always said patience was a gardener's first virtue, but I had no patience left. Only anger, quiet and heavy, pressing on my chest. On Friday, while I was in the greenhouse, I heard footsteps on the gravel. When I stepped outside, Mark was there again, hands on his hips, surveying the place as if he still owned it. "You really went and called the cops?" he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Helen told me." I said nothing, just stood between him and the garden. He looked around, noting the new camera. "Jesus, Walter, paranoid much? You think I'm sneaking around at night like some criminal?" His voice carried that smug amusement people use when they think they've already won. "If you've nothing to hide, you shouldn't mind," I said evenly. That wiped the smile off his face. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You're turning this into something ugly. We're family." "Family doesn't destroy each other's homes," I replied. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you can scare me with your little gadgets? You're old, Walter. Sooner or later, you'll need help. And when that time comes, don't expect us to be there." For a second, I thought he might actually strike me. There was that glint in his eyes, that flash of contempt that has nothing to do with words. But he just shook his head and walked back to his truck, muttering something about old fools and dead flowers. That night I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, the first since Mabel's funeral, and sat in the dark, watching the feed from the camera. The garden lay still under the moonlight, every movement of the wind setting off faint ripples across the petals that had survived. Around midnight the alert tone buzzed. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone. The image was grainy, but clear enough. A figure moving near the fence, then stepping into the garden. Mark. He bent down, picking up something. I couldn't see what. Then turned toward the greenhouse and yanked one of the doors open. I watched him throw a pot against the wall, shards scattering like sparks. Then he looked straight at the camera, his face half lit, expression twisted in something between satisfaction and rage. The feed ended there, motion triggered only for a minute, but it was enough. Proof. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I downloaded the footage onto a flash drive, labeled it with shaking hands, and placed it in the safe under the bed. The satisfaction I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt an emptiness, a strange sorrow for the man my daughter had chosen, and for the way he was dragging her into his bitterness. Later that morning, Helen called. Her voice was tense, almost tearful. "Dad, Mark told me you're accusing him again. Please, can we stop this? It's tearing us apart." I told her calmly that I had evidence, that I wasn't imagining things. She went silent for a long time before whispering, "Just don't do anything rash, okay?" Then she hung up. I spent that day walking the perimeter of the property, checking the locks, reinforcing the fence, anything to keep busy. By evening, exhaustion settled into my bones, but my mind wouldn't quiet. What had begun as an insult had turned into something larger, darker, a campaign not just against the garden, but against me, against the idea that I could still protect what was mine. The thought that he might come back again gnawed at me. Yet beneath the fear, there was also a spark of grim resolve. Let him come, I thought. Let him dig and trample and sneer. He had no idea what those flowers were truly worth, not just in memory or sentiment, but in fact. A few years before Mabel died, a researcher from the university had visited to study her hybrids. She'd sent him samples, carefully labeled bulbs with notes in her elegant cursive, and he had written back months later, ecstatic. One of her strains, he said, showed a unique genetic variation rare enough to attract collectors. At the time, we laughed about it. What would I even do with rich botanists, she'd said. But after her death, a letter arrived, an appraisal, unofficial but detailed, estimating that some of her cultivars could fetch tens of thousands if registered and propagated. I'd tucked that letter away, not for profit, but as quiet proof of her genius. Now, standing in the ruined garden, I realized Mark's cruelty might have accidentally destroyed something of measurable, undeniable value. The thought sickened and electrified me at once. The next morning I went through the old files in Mabel's writing desk until I found the letter, yellowed but legible. I read it again, feeling both grief and vindication. She hadn't just created beauty, she'd created legacy. And Mark, in his arrogance, had crushed it beneath his boots. That evening, I called the university's botanical department, speaking with a new professor who promised to send someone to reevaluate the site. "We'd be honored to see Mrs. Mason's work," he said. His words gave me a strange, steady strength. Maybe the garden could still be saved, not just in memory, but in name. Maybe Mabel's work would outlive even this ugliness. But even as I made plans, a darker thought lingered. If the flowers truly held value, Mark's destruction might not have been simple spite. Maybe he had found the letter, or heard something from Helen. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing, erasing the evidence of something he couldn't claim. As the sun set, I looked out over the yard, the camera's red light blinking softly like a warning star. And I knew the fight was far from over. What had started as a desecration had become a war of inheritance, of pride, of secrets buried deeper than roots. And I, frail as I was, had no intention of losing. The university specialist arrived on a gray morning that smelled faintly of rain and iron, the kind of morning Mabel would have called a gardener's pause. His name was Dr. Alden Pierce, a tall, mild-mannered man in his 40s, who wore his curiosity like a second skin. When I met him at the gate, he shook my hand firmly and looked around the property with the cautious reverence of someone entering a chapel. The garden, even in its ruined state, seemed to silence him for a moment. The lilies lay broken, the bed scarred from Mark's shovel, yet there was still an undeniable geometry in the chaos, a stubborn beauty refusing to die. Mrs. Mason was quite the hybridizer, he said, setting down his case of instruments. I've read some of her correspondence from years ago. She was ahead of her time in understanding cross-pollination cycles. Hearing someone speak of her with professional respect filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. I led him along the paths, explaining what had happened, how many of her cultivars were lost. He crouched beside a surviving stalk, his gloved fingers gentle as he inspected the damaged bulbs. "This one," he murmured, "could be from the Azure Star line. If it is, it's extremely valuable." The word valuable hung in the damp air like a secret finally spoken aloud. I wanted to ask him to define it, to quantify what extremely meant. But I stayed silent, afraid of reducing Mabel's work to numbers. Still, the question must have shown on my face, because he glanced up and smiled politely. "You should know," he said, "that some collectors and botanical foundations pay substantial sums for the rights to propagate unique hybrids. We're talking tens of thousands per variety. Sometimes more if documentation exists." He looked at me pointedly. "Did your wife keep records?" I nodded, almost trembling. "Everything. She had notebooks, cross diagrams, even pollen samples sealed in wax paper." His eyes widened. "If you still have them, that's invaluable. They could prove authenticity." After he left that afternoon, promising to return with his assistant and take formal samples, I went inside and opened the old trunk at the foot of the bed. The smell of cedar and paper rose like a ghost. Inside were Mabel's notebooks, their covers worn smooth, pages filled with tiny, neat handwriting and ink smudges from nights she worked too late. I ran my fingers over the words and felt her presence in every stroke. She had numbered each hybrid, listing cross-parents, bloom colors, even emotional notes. 14, second-generation cross between lily of the valley and Siberian iris, fragrance reminiscent of June mornings. I read until my eyes blurred, realizing for the first time how vast her private world had been, how little I'd understood the quiet genius that bloomed beside me all those years. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by her papers, I heard the sound of a car engine slowing outside. I peered through the curtains, Mark's truck again. My stomach clenched. He didn't get out immediately, just sat there with the headlights cutting through the twilight, idling like a predator, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Finally, he stepped out, holding a folder. I opened the door before he could knock. His smile was too smooth. "Evening, Walter," he said. "We need to talk." I let him in, though every instinct screamed against it. He walked around the living room, eyes landing on Mabel's photographs, then the papers on the table. "Busy night?" he asked. I ignored the bait. "What do you want, Mark?" He took a breath, then held up the folder. "Helen and I have been speaking with a lawyer about the property. We think it's time to formalize some things." My chest tightened. "What things?" "Your future," he said quickly, as if he were doing me a kindness. "You're alone out here. Helen worries constantly. We just want to make sure the house and the land are managed properly if anything happens to you." I understood immediately. "Managed," I repeated slowly. "You mean taken." His smile faltered. "Don't be dramatic. We're talking about a transfer of rights, partial ownership. You'd still live here as long as you wanted. It's just paperwork." I laughed then, a bitter sound that startled even me. "You think I don't see through you? You destroy what you can't understand, and now you want to own what's left." His eyes hardened. "That's not fair. You're misinterpreting everything. Helen and I are trying to protect this place." "From who?" I demanded. "From me?" He opened his mouth to reply, but I was already moving toward the drawer where the flash drive lay. I pulled it out and set it on the table between us. "You should know something before you try to rewrite the law," I said. "I have this. It shows what you did, every minute of it." His face went pale, then red. "What are you talking about?" "The garden," I said softly. "The night you came back, I installed cameras. You were recorded destroying her lilies." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a short, harsh laugh. "You're bluffing." "Try me." I met his gaze until he looked away. He grabbed the folder, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that dust fell from the beams. When his engine finally faded, I sat down, shaking. My hands were damp, my heart hammering. I had confronted him, yes, but the victory felt hollow. I realized I had just declared war, and men like Mark didn't lose gracefully. 2 days later, Helen arrived unannounced. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "Dad," she began, not meeting my eyes, "Mark told me what you said to him. About some video." I stayed silent. "Please tell me that's not true. Please tell me you didn't install cameras like a paranoid recluse." "I did," I said simply. "And I have the footage." Her shoulders sagged. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're tearing us apart." I almost laughed again at the repetition of those words, as if the family she described still existed. "He did that himself," I replied. "He ruined your mother's garden. He trespassed. I have proof." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "You don't understand. He was trying to fix things. He didn't mean—" "Stop protecting him," I said, my voice low. "He's using you, Helen. Can't you see that?" Something inside her broke then, the facade cracking. "You think I don't know?" she whispered. "You think I don't see what he is? But what choice do I have? You're not the one paying the bills or holding the mortgage or facing his temper every day." The confession hung between us like smoke. For the first time in years, I saw not a schemer, not an accomplice, but a frightened woman trapped in her own home. "You can leave him," I said gently. "You and Jason could stay here." She shook her head violently. "It's not that simple. He has debts, business loans in my name. If I walk away, I lose everything." I wanted to tell her that money meant nothing, that she still had me, but the words stuck in my throat. The years of distance between us made comfort impossible. She wiped her eyes and looked up. "Please, Dad, just don't do anything rash. If this goes to the police, It'll ruin us all." Her voice broke on the last word. I understood then that us no longer meant family. It meant her and Mark, bound together by fear and secrecy. When she left, I stood on the porch watching her drive away, realizing the road between us was longer than the distance to her house. That evening, Dr. Pierce returned with his assistant. They collected samples, took photographs, and documented everything meticulously. Before leaving, he handed me a sealed envelope. "I thought you might like to see this," he said. "A preliminary appraisal based on what we've identified." After he drove off, I sat at the table and opened it. Inside was a typed report, clinical and unemotional, listing 5 surviving hybrids, their estimated potential value, and a note at the bottom. Collective worth approximately $50,000 USD, contingent upon verification of lineage. $50,000. The number stared up at me like an accusation. Proof not just of beauty, but of tangible worth, the kind that men like Mark could understand. For a while I couldn't move. The garden that he'd called worthless weeds was worth more than his car, more than his pride. I imagined his face when he found out, the disbelief curdling into rage. The thought should have pleased me, but it only deepened the sadness. Mabel would have hated all this, money, anger, lawsuits. She believed gardens healed. Now hers had become a battlefield. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and locked it in the same safe as the flash drive. My hands trembled, but this time from something close to resolution. There would be no more pleading, no more explaining. If they wanted to strip me of dignity, I would fight with facts, not emotion. That night, thunder rolled again across the valley. I went out to the porch and sat in the dark, the scent of wet earth rising like memory. Lightning flickered over the ruined flower beds, illuminating the faint outlines of new growth pushing through the mud. Life refusing to surrender. I whispered to Mabel, telling her about the appraisal, about Helen's visit, about how everything was spiraling beyond repair. "I don't know what you'd do," I said, "but I think I finally understand what you meant when you said beauty demands defense." The wind shifted, carrying a single petal across the porch. It landed at my feet, pale blue, even in the stormlight. I picked it up and held it to my heart, a small, fragile piece of what was left and what was still to come. The next morning, I received an email from Dr. Pierce confirming that his report would be submitted to the State Botanical Registry. "You should consider patenting these hybrids," he wrote. "They could bear your wife's name officially." I stared at the screen, feeling something tighten in my throat. For decades, Mabel had tended this garden quietly, without ambition, and now the world might finally recognize her. The irony was cruel. She wasn't here to see it, and the people who remained cared only for what could be sold. Still, a strange calm settled over me. Whatever happened next, I had the truth, and the truth, once unearthed, grows roots of its own. That was the day I stopped feeling afraid. Whatever Mark planned, whatever lies he spun, none of it could change the fact that his greed had exposed him. The storm had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt Mabel's spirit not as a memory, but as a force moving through me, patient and unyielding, like the garden itself. I closed the laptop, stepped outside, and looked at the faint sprouts breaking through the soil. The battle was no longer about loss. It was about legacy. And I intended to make sure hers endured long after both Mark's arrogance and my body had turned to dust. The days that followed the appraisal settled into a deceptive calm, the kind that makes you think the storm has passed when in truth it has only gathered strength beyond the horizon. For a little while I allowed myself to believe that everything was beginning to right itself. The university's confirmation had given me a strange sense of peace, a feeling that Mabel's work was finally protected, that her name would stand firm even if I didn't. But calm is a dangerous thing. It dulls the senses, makes you slow to recognize the sound of new trouble approaching. It began with the letter. It came one morning in a plain envelope with the return address of a local law firm I didn't know. I assumed it was another notice about taxes or utilities, and I didn't bother to open it until after breakfast. I remember the taste of the coffee turning bitter the moment I read the first line. It wasn't a bill. It was a notice of intent, a legal document stating that my daughter and her husband were petitioning for joint guardianship over me, citing concerns about my cognitive stability and financial decision-making capacity. For a long moment, I just stared at the words, unable to process them. My name looked strange on the page, detached, as though it belonged to someone else. There were sentences written about me in the cold language of bureaucracy. Subject exhibits signs of paranoia. Potential danger to self and property. Recommended evaluation for competency. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The first thought that came to me was not anger, but disbelief. Helen, my own daughter, had signed her name to this. It was there in ink, elegant and deliberate. I sat down at the table, the paper trembling in my hand, and whispered, "What have you done, Mabel? How did we raise her into this?" When I finally called Helen, she didn't answer. It was Mark who picked up. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "Walter, we didn't want it to come to this, but you've left us no choice. You're making irrational decisions, talking about lawsuits and conspiracies. We just want to make sure you're taken care of." I told him that I knew exactly what they were doing, that they were trying to take the house, the land, everything. He sighed theatrically. "This isn't about property. It's about your well-being. You can't manage things anymore. You're forgetting to eat, to lock doors. You've got cameras everywhere. That's not normal, Walter." His voice was syrupy, patronizing. "Helen's heartbroken, but she's scared. We're all scared for you." I felt something cold slide through my veins. "You should be scared," I said quietly, "but not for me." He hung up without another word. By the end of the week, a court notice arrived scheduling a hearing for the following month. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps, every passing car like someone watching. The weight of betrayal pressed down heavier than loneliness ever had. I couldn't understand how Helen, who once wept over a crushed butterfly, could now sign away her father's dignity. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was Mark's hand guiding everything. He'd found the perfect weapon, the law itself, to make me seem frail, confused, unfit. He didn't have to steal the house. He only had to convince the world that I wasn't capable of owning it. One evening I drove into town to see my old neighbor Leonard, a man I had known for 30 years, someone who used to share tomatoes and gossip over the fence. I told him what was happening, hoping for advice, or at least sympathy. He listened carefully, nodding in all the right places. "Terrible business," he said, shaking his head. "You can't trust lawyers these days." I noticed, though, that he avoided meeting my eyes. When I asked if he'd be willing to testify on my behalf, to confirm that I was lucid, that I managed my property responsibly, he hesitated. "You know I'd like to help, Walt," he said slowly, "but Mark's been by a few times. He mentioned something about a zoning change, said there might be opportunities for us if the property transitions hands." His voice faltered. "I've got grandkids, you understand?" It hit me like a blow. The betrayal wasn't just within the family now. It had seeped into the neighborhood, into the small community that once felt like home. I realized Mark was building a web, whispering to people, offering promises, painting me as the confused old man standing in the way of progress. The idea of being reduced to a cautionary tale in the mouths of neighbors who once shared our harvest made my skin crawl. When I got home that night, I sat for a long time in the dark, the house humming softly around me. I remembered how Mabel used to say that evil rarely arrives with horns and fire. It usually comes wearing a polite smile and carrying paperwork. A few days later, I received another surprise, a letter from the bank. It informed me that a request had been made to access my account for joint oversight. The signature authorization line bore my name, shakily forged. My vision blurred with rage. They weren't even hiding anymore. I drove to the branch the next morning, cane tapping furiously against the floor tiles, and demanded to speak with the manager. She was kind, but cautious, explaining that without proof of fraud, she couldn't act. "You'll need an attorney, Mr. Mason," she said softly, her expression full of pity. I almost laughed. Attorneys were expensive, and my savings weren't deep. But pride, I discovered, can generate its own kind of fuel. I found a small law office on the edge of town, run by a woman named Julia Hensley. She was young, sharp-eyed, and efficient. After I told her the story, she leaned back in her chair, studying me. "You have the footage?" she asked. I nodded. "And the appraisal documents?" I handed her the envelope. She read for several minutes, her expression tightening. "Mr. Mason, this isn't just about guardianship. They're building a case to claim you're incapacitated, so they can liquidate the estate before probate. It's textbook financial coercion." The words sent a chill through me, not because I didn't understand them, but because I did. She looked up. "Do not speak to them directly again. Let everything go through me, and make copies of all your evidence. If we move quickly, we can file for an injunction." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept. It wasn't peaceful. My dreams were full of Mabel's voice, calling from somewhere deep beneath the earth, but it was sleep nonetheless. When I woke, I felt steadier. There was a plan, and plans, even desperate ones, give old men purpose. Over the next days, Julia helped me draft statements, compile documents, and retrieve the footage from the camera. Watching it again was unbearable, seeing Mark's face lit by that cold night glow, watching him tear apart the garden with his bare hands. Yet in the footage, I also found something unexpected. In one corner of the frame, briefly illuminated by the motion light, was another figure, smaller, hesitant, Leonard, my neighbor. He stood there for several seconds, watching, before turning away. The sight hollowed me. He had seen everything and said nothing. When I confronted him the next morning, he stammered excuses. "I didn't think it was my place, Walt. I figured you two would sort it out as family." The cowardice in his tone was worse than hostility. "You stood there," I said quietly. "You saw him destroy her life's work. You saw him humiliate me, and you said nothing." He mumbled something about minding his business, but his eyes darted toward the fence line, toward the property Mark had promised to buy. I walked away without another word. That was the day I stopped expecting decency from anyone tied to Mark's world. The pressure mounted. Helen called once more, her voice shaking. "Dad, please withdraw the complaint. Mark says this will ruin his business. We can make things right privately." There was a pause, then she added, "You'll lose everything if this goes to court." Her words sounded rehearsed, coached. I told her the only thing I could. If I lose everything, At least I'll lose it standing." She started to cry, but the sound no longer pierced me. I realized that pity had replaced love in her heart, and pity, when mixed with fear, becomes contempt. The next week brought another blow. Julia called, her voice tense. "Mr. Mason, I just received notice that someone submitted a counterclaim challenging your ownership of certain botanical materials on the property. They're alleging the hybrids were developed during your daughter's residency here and thus belong to her and her spouse as co-creators." I nearly dropped the phone. "That's absurd," I said. "Mabel did the work decades before they moved in." Julia sighed. "It's a stalling tactic, but a clever one. They're trying to blur the timeline, make it messy. If they convince a judge the ownership is shared, they can freeze your right to sell or register the plants until the matter's resolved." For a long moment I couldn't speak. Then quietly I said, "They're trying to bury her twice." Julia was silent, perhaps understanding more than words could convey. "We'll fight it," she said finally, "but it's going to get uglier before it gets better." I thanked her and hung up, staring at the empty living room. The clock ticked softly, indifferent. The house, once warm, now felt like a witness to something shameful, the collapse of a family into greed and legal manipulation. That night, I walked through the garden under the pale moonlight. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant smoke. The damage from Mark's rampage was still visible, but new shoots had begun to push through the soil, fragile yet persistent. I thought of how life refuses to obey cruelty, how even trampled roots find ways to reach the light. I spoke aloud then, not caring who heard. "Mabel, they think they've beaten me. They think paper and signatures can erase you. But I've got your truth right here in this dirt." My voice shook, but did not break. I realized then that I no longer felt like a victim. The anger had settled into something steadier. Resolve. The next morning, Julia called again. "Good news," she said. "The judge approved our injunction. They can't move any assets or claim guardianship until after the hearing." Relief washed through me so abruptly that I had to sit down. "Bad news," she added after a pause. "Someone leaked the appraisal report to the local paper. It's on the front page. Elderly man's garden worth fortune. Family dispute turns ugly." I didn't need to ask who leaked it. The article quoted sources close to the family, and I could almost hear Mark dictating the lines himself. My phone began ringing nonstop. Reporters, neighbors, even old acquaintances pretending to care. I turned it off and sat in silence. The privacy of my grief was gone. What had once been a sanctuary had become a spectacle. For several nights after that, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window watching the garden, waiting for some new blow to fall. The moon moved across the sky, the flowers shifting in its light, like faces I couldn't quite recognize. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a strange clarity took hold. They could lie, forge, manipulate, but they couldn't change the truth of what was growing there. Mabel's hand was still in every petal, every seed. Her garden was the record of a life lived honestly, and that was something no court could erase. When dawn finally came, I poured myself a cup of cold coffee and looked out one last time before the hearing. The garden was quiet, but alive, defiant even. In that stillness, I made a promise, not of revenge, but of endurance. Whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes. Let them bring their documents, their witnesses, their false concern. The earth remembers who tends it with love and who tears it apart for gain. And in that memory, I knew, lay my truest defense. The hearing took place on a pale October morning, the kind of day when the sun hangs low and weak behind a veil of fog, as if it too would rather stay hidden from what must be done. I wore the suit Mabel bought me 20 years ago for our daughter's wedding, a size too loose now, its shoulders slumped like my own. When I caught my reflection in the courthouse window, I barely recognized the man staring back. Thinner, smaller, but somehow more solid, as if grief had carved him into stone. Julia met me at the steps, her briefcase in one hand, her expression calm but fierce. "Remember," she said quietly, "we're not proving you're perfect. We're proving you're still standing." Those words stayed with me all day. Inside, the courtroom smelled of paper and varnish, that mixture of bureaucracy and old dust that carries no warmth. Mark and Helen were already seated across the aisle. She avoided my eyes. He didn't bother to hide his smirk. The proceedings began with the judge reading the claims. Concern for my health, erratic behavior, supposed forgetfulness, the insinuation that I might squander shared family assets. Each phrase landed like a bruise. When Mark took the stand, he spoke in that measured tone he used when selling clients on bad investments, pretending to be reasonable, rational, caring. "We're not trying to hurt him," he said, glancing at the judge with feigned humility. "We just want to make sure his legacy, and my mother-in-law's work, are preserved correctly. He's been under a lot of stress. Sometimes he forgets things. He's convinced I vandalized the garden, when in reality I was trying to help." He looked at me then, almost pitying. I love my father-in-law, but he needs guidance. I sat there, hands clasped in my lap, listening to my own life rewritten in polite tones. Julia's hand brushed mine briefly, a silent reminder to stay still. When Helen took the stand, my heart clenched. She looked fragile, her voice trembling as she described her worry for me, her desperation to keep me safe. For a moment, I almost believed her performance, until she glanced toward Mark for approval. That single look turned my sorrow into clarity. I realized she wasn't acting out of greed alone. She was acting out of fear, trapped in a web he had spun tighter around her than I ever imagined. Then it was our turn. Julia called me up last, after submitting the appraisal and the expert reports verifying Mabel's authorship of the hybrids. My cane echoed softly against the floor as I walked to the witness stand. The courtroom was silent except for the creak of wood. I swore the oath, my voice steady, and looked at the judge directly. "Your Honor," I began, "I may be old, but I am not confused. The only confusion here is the one my son-in-law has created for his own advantage." I could feel Mark's eyes burning into me, but I didn't turn. I am the sole caretaker of my wife's legacy, a garden she tended for 40 years. Those flowers are not property to be divided or sold. They are her life's work and mine. I have evidence that the man claiming to protect me trespassed on my land and destroyed those plants. I have it recorded. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Julia nodded to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights and played the video. The footage filled the screen. Mark under the glare of the motion light, his hands ripping through the soil, pots shattering against the greenhouse wall. The sound of breaking clay echoed like bones snapping. Then came the still frame where he looked up, face caught in half-shadow, a sneer of contempt freezing him in time. No one spoke. Even Helen covered her mouth. The silence stretched until the judge cleared his throat. "Is that you, Mr. Williams?" he asked. Mark shifted in his seat, color draining from his face. "It's been edited," he stammered. "He's manipulating." But his voice faltered under the weight of his own image staring back. Julia rose, her tone sharp but controlled. "The footage is time-stamped and verified by the manufacturer. There is no alteration. Mr. Mason installed the camera weeks before the incident, concerned about trespassing. The report from the police corroborates the date. This isn't a question of confusion or senility. This is a question of deliberate destruction and coercion. She handed over the notarized documents like a blade. Mark tried to recover, but every word he spoke only twisted him further. The judge's expression hardened. "I think I've seen enough," he said finally. "Mr. Mason appears fully competent. I find no grounds for guardianship. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for potential property damage and fraud investigation." The gavel struck once, a dull wooden sound that seemed to reverberate through every year of my life. Just like that, it was over. Julia touched my shoulder gently. "You won, Walter." But I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, emptied out. Across the aisle, Helen was crying silently. Mark muttered something to his lawyer and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The echo followed me long after we left the building. Outside, the fog had lifted. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and exhaust, the first true breath of autumn. Julia handed me a copy of the judgment, folded neatly. "They can't touch your property now," she said. "You're safe." I nodded, though safety felt like a word belonging to another world. She offered to drive me home, but I declined. I wanted to see the road, to feel the distance between that courtroom and the garden that had started it all. The drive was long and quiet. The trees along the highway had begun to turn, their colors bleeding into gold and rust, the slow decay of beauty that somehow felt like forgiveness. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, the garden still scarred, but stubbornly alive. I walked through the gate and paused beside the pond. The lilies that had survived were in bloom again, pale and luminous against the dark water. I knelt, ignoring the protest in my knees, and whispered, "We did it, Mabel. They tried to bury you, but you're still here." A wind passed through the trees, stirring the remaining petals like confetti at some quiet celebration. I stayed there for a long time, until the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of ash. That evening, as I sat on the porch, headlights appeared at the end of the road. For a moment my heart seized. I thought it was Mark, returning for revenge. But it was Helen's car. She stepped out slowly, hands trembling, eyes swollen from crying. She didn't come up right away. She just stood by the gate, as if waiting for permission to enter. "You can come in," I said finally. She crossed the yard, stopping a few feet away from me. "Dad, I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking. "I didn't know he'd gone that far. I thought we were just protecting you." I looked at her for a long time, seeing not the woman she'd become, but the child who once knelt beside her mother, planting seeds with tiny hands. "You wanted to protect me," I said quietly, "but you forgot I wasn't the one who needed protection." She began to sob then, the sound raw and unguarded. I wanted to comfort her, but something inside me had shifted. The wound was too deep for easy forgiveness. "He's gone," she whispered. "He packed a bag and left. I don't even know where." I nodded slowly. "Good. Let the world deal with him now." We stood in silence for a while, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the dying leaves. Then she looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Can I come home for a while?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "For a while," I said. "But we do it my way this time." That night we sat together at the kitchen table, just as we used to, though the air between us was heavy with everything that couldn't be said. She told me about the debts, about the lies Mark had fed her, about how he'd convinced her I was losing my mind so he could get access to the property. I listened without interruption. When she finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. "I just don't want to lose you, too." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You already did," I said. But you can still find me again if you're willing to work for it. Later, after she went to bed in her old room, I stepped outside once more. The moon was high, casting silver light over the garden. I could see my reflection in the pond, older, smaller, but still alive. For months I had lived in fear of losing the house, the memories, the truth. But standing there, I realized that everything they had tried to take from me had already been secured in something they could never touch. The soil, the roots, the patient persistence of what grows despite cruelty. The garden was wounded, yes, but it would heal. So would I, though in a slower, lonelier way. When I went back inside, the house was quiet. I passed Mabel's portrait on the wall and stopped for a moment. "It's done," I whispered. "You can rest now." And for the first time in years, I felt she truly could, and maybe, just maybe, so could I. It has been almost a year since the hearing, and the seasons have turned over themselves like pages in a book I thought I'd already finished reading. The garden lives again, though not as it once was. I have rebuilt it slowly, cautiously, with the help of volunteers from the university who came after Dr. Pierce's report was published. They call it the Mabel Mason Botanical Heritage Site now, a title that sounds too grand for the patch of earth where two people simply loved beauty enough to tend it. Yet every time I walk among the new rows of lilies, orchids, and irises, I feel her there, not as memory, but as presence, stitched into the very air. The younger gardeners treat me with the kind of respect reserved for relics, always careful, always polite, as if one wrong word might make me crumble. I find their reverence both touching and faintly comical. If they only knew how much rage once grew in this soil, they might treat it with less ceremony and more awe. Helen still lives here with me. At first, it was awkward, the silence between us thick with the things neither of us dared to name. She moved into the small guest room, and for weeks we spoke only about practicalities, grocery lists, weather forecasts, mail. But grief and guilt are like vines. They twist through the cracks until they find light. One evening in spring, as we were pruning roses, she suddenly said, "Mom would hate this place being called a heritage site." I looked up from the soil. "She'd say we were turning love into paperwork," I answered, and for the first time in years we both laughed. That laughter broke something open. Since then, we've been learning each other again, not as father and daughter bound by obligation, but as two people scarred by the same wound, trying to keep it from festering. Sometimes she still cries at night. Sometimes I hear her whispering apologies to her mother's photograph in the hallway. I never interrupt. Healing, like gardening, cannot be rushed. Mark never returned. The sheriff told us he left the state soon after the district attorney began reviewing the case. I don't ask for updates. The law will take its time, and justice, when it comes, rarely looks like vengeance. In truth, I don't wish him punishment anymore. That surprises me. For a long time, I carried my anger like armor, convinced it was the only thing keeping me upright. But anger, like metal, rusts from the inside. What remains now is not rage, but something steadier, a quiet insistence that truth endures longer than deceit. If he ever drives down this road again, he'll find the garden blooming brighter than before, and that, I think, will wound him more deeply than any verdict. In the months after the case, letters began arriving from strangers, botanists, widowers, gardeners, people who had read about the trial in the local papers. They wrote to thank me, to tell me about their own losses, their own small battles to preserve something that mattered. I keep those letters in a box on the porch next to Mabel's old gloves. Sometimes I read them aloud to her when the evenings are quiet. I like to think she'd smile at the idea that her lilies could bring comfort to people she never met. Perhaps that is what legacy truly is. Not fame or fortune, but the echo of kindness carried forward by those who understand it. I spend my mornings now in the greenhouse, teaching a handful of students who come to learn about hybridization. They remind me of Mabel in her youth, earnest, gentle, hungry for beauty without realizing how fragile it is. I show them how to graft, how to read the soil, how to wait. They always want to hurry the process, and I tell them that impatience is the gardener's first sin. The earth has its own clock, I say. You can't force a bloom before its time. They nod politely, but I can tell they don't really believe me yet. Someday they will. In the afternoons, Helen and I sit on the porch and watch the light change over the pond. The rebuilt lilies shimmer in the water, each bloom a small defiance against decay. She's taken to keeping a journal, writing about her mother, about us, about what happened. Sometimes she reads bits of it aloud, and her words are softer than I deserve. "You taught me that forgiveness isn't forgetting," she wrote once. "It's remembering without the poison." I didn't reply then, but later that night I placed a note in her notebook. Forgiveness is a seed. It grows if you stop digging it up to see if it's alive. There are days when my body betrays me, when my hands tremble too much to hold the shears, when I forget the names of certain plants. But the garden doesn't mind. It forgives the old. It knows that death is not an ending, but a continuation of care in another form. I've arranged for the land to pass to the university after I'm gone, with one condition, that Helen remain caretaker as long as she wishes. She cried when she signed the papers, and I told her it was all right. This place doesn't belong to any of us, not really. We are only its temporary guardians, its witnesses. Some evenings, when the sky burns gold before fading into violet, I sit by the pond and think about time, how it loops and folds, how it carries us through storms and back into calm. I used to believe that justice was something external, something delivered by courts or fate. Now I know it's quieter than that. Justice is the simple act of survival, of choosing not to become what tried to destroy you. The garden taught me that. So did Mabel. So did the pain. Last week, the first of the new hybrids bloomed, a delicate, deep blue flower that Dr. Pierce insisted we name officially. Helen asked what to call it, and without hesitation I said, "Mabel's Promise." Its petals curve like cupped hands, and when the sun hits them, they shine as if lit from within. I like to think she's there in every shimmer, whispering, "Keep growing." When the light fades and the air cools, I close the gate and listen to the crickets beginning their evening chorus. The house behind me is smaller now, quieter, but no longer lonely. The world has moved on, as it always does. But here, in this garden, everything remains in motion, yet still somehow whole. I don't know how much longer I'll be around to tend it, but it doesn't matter. Mabel's work and mine will outlive us both. The flowers don't need my hands anymore. They have the memory of love, and that, I've come to learn, is the most fertile soil of all.